Friday. I am thrilled to welcome you all to the inaugural book talk for What a Building Does by Philip Cox and Niall. A lot of friends and family here tonight, which is amazing. So I'll be quick on introductions. This is the culmination of 5 years of incredible work. They've been documenting the work of Evans Woollen, an Indiana architect, the dean of Indiana architects. And this is the first time that his work has been really compiled into a singular body of work. So a lot of new archive work has been done, a ton of new photography, and kind of the first pass at writing the history of this. So we'll have about 45 minutes, an hour to talk about everything. We'll get a chance to ask some questions at the end of this. And most importantly, there'll be books for sale after this to take home. And then following it up, there will be a migration to the river just down the road in Chinatown to toast their amazing work. So with that, I will hand it over to them to kick us off.
Grant, Grant is an Indian friend, architect, who's done work in Indiana, a bunch of other places. So that's the person to help us moderate today. By show of hands, I think we have like pretty strong Indianapolis crowd. Like, raise your hand if you have some sort of connection to Indianapolis. Okay. So we're gonna hopefully, like, if you haven't been there, maybe you want to go. If not, just don't tell us. We're going to do a bit of a double feature. I'm going to talk for like 15 minutes, hopefully, about just the project in general, some of the research Grant was talking about, and then I'll pass to Niall, who will go more deeply into the photography, which is really the heart of the project, and then some anecdotes about some buildings. And yeah, thank you very much for coming. It's really exciting for us. So, as Grant said, this is a biography of really several things, but most importantly, this guy, Evans Woollen, who was known as the Dean of Indiana Architects during his lifetime. And if you don't know who Evans is, don't worry. Before starting this project, those of us are born and raised in Indianapolis, we did not know who he was either. As Grant alluded to, surprisingly little has been written about him, and most that has been written about him has been more focused on controversy and kind of sensationalization of his work, his career, and the reception of his buildings. So even if you don't know who the man is, if you're from Indianapolis, you know the work. Any local will recognize many of these buildings. And if you go to Indianapolis today, you'll still stumble on a well-designed library, church, house, theater, office building, kind of all hiding in plain sight. And as part of the book, what we want to do is catalog almost over 120 projects for the very first time. So in a way, we're trying to write the first draft of history about someone who is really important to the architectural legacy of Indianapolis. And as you can see, just by some of these snapshots, this is like a fourth of the total body of work. It was a lot more diverse and rich and complicated than we expected. Many of these projects were kind of first instances of a type of design in Indianapolis. Often shopped, often divided, and were polarizing in their time, especially in the town most known for its cultural and political conservatism more than its embrace of new ideas. But we think these ideas are still relevant. When Woollen died in 2016, the Indianapolis Star said there's one man mostly responsible for what Indianapolis looks like today, would be Evans Woollen. So he was a pace setter from his local peers, a beacon for Indianapolis on the national stage, and he cut a very different profile, and we think that's a legacy worth being aware of today. If you haven't, sell a plug, buy the book, but if you haven't, here's what it looks like inside. Our hope was to kind of exhume Woollen's history and bring it back to light. For some reason, it's been, in our opinion, overlooked over the past several decades. And we wrote it, though, specifically for a local Indianapolis audience. We don't think Woollen, was the best architect ever, or his buildings need to be kind of restored and trapped in amber, never to be changed, but more that just to give a baseline education of what these designs meant in their time, what they might mean to us today, and give context for the ideas and shape them. And we think that's important. Many of these works that you see today, Woollen and Niall will go in much more deeply into this, have been changed in pretty careless ways for our undergrad. So we think more context, more knowledge, the baseline understanding of both Woollen and his contributions to Indianapolis is important. This is, for those who don't know, Indianapolis, and as much as this is a book about one man, it's also kind of a biography of the city. A city in a moment of transformation in post-war America from 1945 to late 1990s. And as Indianapolis itself was transforming, reinventing its image, Woollen was right there in the center of it, helping to contribute to that new image. Recasting itself as a new, more modern, and more hopefully exciting place to be. So Woollen's story is also Indianapolis' story, and as a native son, Woollen felt the sometimes irrational tug to return home and to kind of root himself in the place that he was born and raised. He felt a sense of duty to get back to his city, however he knew how, which was history architecture. But statements like that and press that he received like this masked a far more nuanced and sometimes strained relationship with his hometown and with his own broader, we would say, Midwestern identity. He was by turns Indianapolis' cheerleader as well as his harshest critic, proud local architect, and anything but. And as if you've dug into the book, these paradoxes are very much, we believe, part of his story. But ultimately, we think we should remember Woollen and his work because of the identity for the city that his buildings kind of pointed to. A richer identity than is often usually imagined for Indianapolis, one with a sense of place that was all its own. So where does Woollen's story begin? In a way, he was sort of an insider and an outsider. But although born and raised in Indianapolis, he actually spent most of his childhood and college years and early career outside the state on the East Coast. He went to boarding school and then Yale. And it was at Yale he first was introduced to modernism, which was just kind of percolating through American universities at the time, and was met and was mentored in many ways by kind of the giants of the modern art and architecture movement. He was a student and employee of Philip Johnson. Kahn was his thesis advisor. He took classes with Joseph Albers. So he was really at the center of the modern movement in the 1950s at a pretty formative time for modern architecture and design's kind of formation in America. He was the only Indianapolis architect who could claim this kind of direct connection with the generation of modernists at the time, and especially from when he moved back to Indianapolis after doing a little bit of early professional work with Philip Johnson in Connecticut. He immediately translated those ideals and those kind of precepts of modernism back to Indianapolis. So you can see this is a building that would easily have fit in someplace like New York, or Connecticut, or even Chicago, or Columbus, Indiana. But this was an anomaly in Indianapolis. This was, we believe, the first true kind of international style modern house built in the city in 1955, and a clear just kind of one-to-one copy of what he had done at Yale and Connecticut. This was the vein that he worked in for his early career, and it's important to remember how radical these ideas were at their time. Now, mid-century modernism is all the rage, but at the time, these were the only designs, not just on the street, in the neighborhood, but away from the whole city. Indianapolis had no tradition of modern architecture in this vein before, and Woollen had a tough time finding clients, no surprise. It's been fun for us to research each of these buildings and try to find as much as we can about them. For instance, that house on the left, we interviewed the daughter of that woman who's standing there, who grew up in the house. She said, quote, "You felt special in that house to have something that beautiful and different and not be a multimillionaire. You felt exotic and special." And you can see here how some of these then radical contemporary styles would show up side by side, some other houses in suburban Indianapolis, Tudor styles, colonial styles, and how different Woollen's work stood out. This was the second beat of Woollen's career. He was very much a shapeshifter, and this is probably his most famous building. Indianapolis people here will know exactly what this is. This is Clues Memorial Hall, built in 1963. And this was, in our estimation, the first truly brutalist building in the city, and not just in the city actually, but actually nationwide. It's really at the very forefront of brutalism's kind of trajectory in the United States. This was a luxury theater that was sort of rising 9 stories tall with concrete framing and these limestone panels. Woollen called it an abstract art collage in the way that the facade here. In a city more known for cornfields and strip malls, buildings like this very much cut the bold profile, put Woollen on the map and the city as a whole on the map. Newspapers from the time, in Indianapolis at least, called it, quote, shocking and fascinating. Woollen remarked that some city leaders wanted to paint the concrete and the stone gold and rip out the interior. But it received a ton of national attention, and like I said, also kind of boosted Woollen's own career. The building was on the cover of Architectural Forum, Fortune magazine, Time magazine, New York Times magazine, as you can see here. When a critic came to review the building, said, finally culture had come to Indianapolis. Quote, it has killed the idea that Indianapolis might be Indian no place. So you get the type of biases from an external lens that Woollen often contended with as a kind of architect who had been educated and had a connection with modernism on a national and international scale, working in Indianapolis in sort of a Midwestern flyover state. But this didn't stop him. In the 1960s and 70s, Woollen was very much off to the races. Clues led to bigger and bolder missions, very much using concrete, brick, industrial materials, and bold forms. All of these tested the aesthetic preferences of a generally conservative populace in Indianapolis. Another great discovery of our book was the strong engagement Woollen had with color, and specifically murals and super graphics. Many of these no longer unfortunately exist today, but on tight budgets, Woollen used color to create instant kind of character and personality. We would call this placemaking today, but that's not something, the term that he would use. He was a lover of color, and he often called his clients chromophobes when they altered his color suggestions. Woollen was exceedingly great at getting national press. He had relationships with many editors, all of the prestigious architectural magazines. And it was rare that a big project of his wasn't covered, but always portrayed through a certain kind of lens. He was a bit of a novelty, a Philip Johnson acolyte making his way out there in the Midwestern hinterlands. No other Indianapolis architect who could fully handle kind of the exposure he got. And for national observers, his buildings were not radical. If anything, they were very legible through an obvious kind of lineage of modern architecture, and if anything, a little bit derivative of models and precedents that had come before. But for the locals who he actually built for, it was a very different story. Those in Indianapolis had a far more ambivalent point of view, at least amongst his brutalist works, which were by far the most polarizing. Controversial was the word most often used by the press. Said one city official in Woollen's work, I don't know that I agree with those who like it just because it appeared in a magazine article. In 1976, he was on the cover of Indianapolis Star magazine, which was kind of as big as you could be in Indianapolis. And the story, which stretched over like 4 or 6 pages, kind of dramatized this persona and really pulled no punches. Very much lately kind of accomplished, controversial, and avant-garde, not the most popular man in town. Woollen responded in the same article saying, well, an architect can't be effective if he isn't controversial. So he did sort of from time to time embrace this persona. But the thesis of our book is that how a building looked was not really what Woollen was truly interested in. It was what a building did in its larger social, urban, and cultural context. This was the period of suburbanization, of white flight, of disinvestment in the inner city. And Woollen disagreed. He was a champion for the rejuvenation of downtown Indianapolis. He called attention to the town's kind of distinct urban grid and urban realm. It was a planned city, and all this was laid out in the 1800s. An almost sort of utopian character that provided the nation's 11th largest city a distinct identity from which to draw. And again, another big discovery from this work was the amount of master planning work that Woollen was involved in, focused on the downtown. So again, Indianapolis folks will recognize all these places as key quadrants of downtown Indianapolis. He contended that livable, enduring cities didn't happen by accident. It was the architect's duty to help shape that urban realm. And ultimately, what people wanted was not what developers, politicians wanted. They wanted connection, community, and a sense of belonging. So his urban planning work sought to deliver that. By the mid-1970s, 1980s, Woollen's practice was changing. He became much more interested in new forms of practice, less about the architect as this kind of sole genius, less about brutalism and these kind of heroic statements of architecture, and more about participation, about access, about kind of democratic process of the design process. He was very involved in what's thing called environmental design, participatory design, holding workshops and charrettes, actually engaging community members in the design process. Today, this is very much kind of rote, but at the time, it was a more radical idea. He would go live with his clients from time to time. He would take up residence on the job site. For a neighborhood master plan, you could open up a pop-up architecture studio and engage residents on their own turf. He said everyone is a collaborator. If he had previously aspired to be what he called Frank Lloyd Wright of Indianapolis, now his goals are becoming much more modest and subdued. And this is just some of the work, the last chapter in his career, which I think Niall and I both feel is maybe the most powerful works. No more concrete, no more colorful super graphics. It was about warmth and invitation, welcome, and protectionism. A corrective to many ideas, many years of architects making their work more about them and less about the people they designed for. This is the New Harmony Inn in New Harmony, Indiana, some of you may have been to. And he called this new way of practice situational architecture. It was kind of a blend of context, a blend of regionalism, postmodernism, and what he called process philosophy, thinking that buildings were never finished. They were just kind of points in a larger continuum of change and evolution. And this is something that he really kind of worked on in the latter decades of his career. Only include this because this is maybe the most beloved work in his portfolio, the one he gets for some reason less credit for, Children's Museum. But you can see again, it was less about austerity and sterility and kind of bold, concrete manifestos, and more about warmth and welcome and putting a smile on a child's face when I go into this front door. Unfortunately, Woollen's story doesn't have the most happy ending. What was his last project, probably the largest of his career, massive library addition down in Indianapolis, was mired in lawsuits and structural and construction problems. It should have been sort of swan song to the city into his career. It was more of a painful asterisk. And I will show much more of this building. Today, if you go to this library, which was completed in 2007, is a huge success and a beloved civic space in Indianapolis. But unfortunately, it kind of left a dark cloud over Woollen's career. The firm shortly closed thereafter. Woollen retired, left the city, and he passed away in Philadelphia in 2016. So just to wrap up before I give the mic to Niall, part of the questioning we have is what is the meaning of Woollen's architecture today? It's not that we think that his buildings are the best thing about Indianapolis or that they are beautiful or not beautiful. And we also don't think they are kind of can be understood purely as historical artifacts of mid-century. And this vestiges of a moment of American optimism that feels very much out of sync with what we're living today. Instead, we're more interested in what happened inside and around these buildings. They were these frameworks for the richness of communal life, places where space and design and social engagement converge. And then, as in now, countless Indianapolis residents live, work, play, learn, worship in these places and continue to do so. In some of his last public remarks in Indianapolis, he kind of took on some of his critics and talked about what it was like to receive so much kind of negative consternation during his time. And he really took it in stride, took sort of sanguine approach, saying, buildings, as we said before, constantly evolving, and the meaning of those buildings and the perception of those buildings is constantly evolving. And he, at least, will abide by that himself. So with that, I'm going to throw it to Niall, and we'll take you through some of those items.
Thank you, Phil. And thank you all for coming. I have a bit of a show and tell, basically, here. A lot of pictures to look through. I'll try to keep on track here. But basically, I kind of want to start by mentioning that there's a constant kind of directive to this whole project. Those to encourage people, especially in need, to consider the built environment a little bit more, to see it, to see the city around them in a little more nuance and understanding. I want to start here with the federal building, into the Cape Park Federal Building downtown. Because along the course of this project, we were making a bunch of trips home through the years. I kept coming back here specifically. I have so many pictures as well. Never fully feeling satisfied, like I captured it. Maybe I was drawn to it because it was so centrally located downtown. It has a big presence on Pennsylvania Street along the American Legion Hall. But it's also perhaps because it's the poster child for buildings people seem to dislike in town. There's a certain kind of magnetism, I think, there. This was shot in the late spring, judging by the light, full green trees. But more obvious to me is the bleachers on the sidewalk. You can see at the bottom of the frame. Under different circumstances, I might come back to photograph this when those are gone. But it kind of helps tell a story about Indianapolis and the civic nature of this building. Those bleachers are set up for the 500 Festival Parade that happens every Memorial Day weekend. Here's that happening shortly after the building was done. Crazy Calliope machine sprinkling down the street. And in the far left, you can see this iconic 7-Up sign that is no longer there, but that's actually standing above Woollen's office at the time. Some more shots of the sort of civic nature of the building. There's a pretty impressive bicycle pedestrian infrastructure right there called the Cultural Trail. And also you see a bar bicycle passing by. Different type of engagement and no less important. And you get a nice view of the building. Some more, you can start to see how the details are almost limitless in photographing it. With the right sun angle, built-in glazers, color fuses, mural, really begins to come alive. Sort of this gradient of color that wraps around the base of this really muscular, brutalist building. Kind of enlivens it for the pedestrian, I feel. Here's the daytime. I like her jacket and that. Sunsets get pretty dramatic in the summer too. I like this picture, mostly because of Reggie Miller on the left. Then moving into the north side of town, going from downtown to College University, here's Memorial Hall. Probably the most well-known and beloved building, I would say. It was a collaboration with John Johansson, actually, that gave Woollen quite a boost locally and nationally. Phil was mentioning. This stage is where Phil and I received our high school diplomas. The exterior. The duo of Woollen and Johansson, they beat out Eros Saarinen during the proposal stage for this job. It came down to a fateful interview with the matriarch of the Clues family and main benefactor of the project. Her name was Edith, and some called her the Duchess in affection. As Woollen would recount through the years, quote, the interview just before us was Eros Saarinen with a wonderful experience. He had finished one of the great theaters in Lincoln Center. Mr. Saarinen was in a hurry, he was late for a jury for the City Opera House, and he was very interested in the City Opera House. And he came in throughout the interview, he kept looking at his watch because he had a plane to catch to Sydney. Mrs. Blues, who was, of course, a prime factor, probably the prime factor, was annoyed at his anxiety to leave. She wanted to get as much out of him as possible. But looking at the clock, which, of course, was a great lesson to me, to never look at the clock again, was distasteful to her, as we later heard it from Alan, who was the principal reason, we believe it, Arrow Sarin was not chosen. We came in after without watching this. That photo Phil showed really shows how the building was originally freestanding on campus, but sort of coming out of the ground, this very horizontal plane. Now it's, as the school has grown, so has the campus buildings, and it's really getting hemmed in. It's pretty tough to photograph from the more distinctive angles, I would say. And here's the December cover of Architectural Forum, 1963. It was the article inside Wax about Blues Hall being one of the 10 buildings that belongs to the future. And inside the house. You can see from the other side too, there's this nice surface parking lot. And another building to the left, it's sort of out of frame, but that is actually going to be soon. I think it'll be connected. There's a new building that's about to happen that's going to connect this sort of glass open facade to the building that's blocking it currently. So it really never be as legible as it was. That facade. And then here's the lobby, just sort of history of things changed with years. Has this really elegant sort of lobby space that you can see these balconies and the mezzanine levels. You can go up and down. Who's coming to the show tonight? They punched out a big window. Now you can see on the right side is all the brightness to the left, streaming in. Changed the carpet too, most notably, and added a bunch of string lights, among other things. At the top floor mezzanine, you can see a small shrine, the original seating carpet. The carpet was spec'd by Woollen, and I think Edith Blues as well. And then just some details to sort of show the superstructure, this concrete frame, in the front of the house, and on the exterior you get these limestone panels, in the back of the house you cells for some cheaper cinder blocks to the right. And just a few blocks down the street from Blues is St. Thomas Aquinas Catholic Church. It was designed as a new sanctuary for an established, pretty progressive congregation in town. In the time of Vatican II, the emphasis was placed heavily on closer connection between the church and its parishioners. Dawn was the stained glass and ornate stonework, and the pulpit that set the priest apart from the people. This building was rather Spartan in its materiality and massing. Modernist simplicity also helped the project's bottom line financially. The budget for the church was $300,000, which is pretty low. A church is a portrait of its people at a particular moment in time, Woollen would say. This building was published extensively. Here's the inside, though, once you step in. You see a different story, I think. So it looks like a dark fortress from the outside, feels light, airy, and comfortable inside. But there's just windows that are placed very strategically that offer some dramatic lighting effects here. There's the sort of altar cross installation, and there's a Sunday service in the right. And there's St. Thomas watching the door. I want to talk about some houses too. This is the C. Beecher Hogan residence of Vermont. This is actually the first known completed building that Evans did while he was still enrolled at Yale for his English teacher. It's got a lake getaway up in Vermont. That's on Lake Champlain. And here, the sort of Midwestern prairie style influence of Frank Lloyd Wright shows itself in Woollen's work. Certainly one of the stark international style modernism that would become his early go-to. Well, for this house, it's more accurate to point to Paul Schweiker's effect on Woollen, an influential Chicago person at the time, who Woollen had interned with during his time there. Then back to Buchanan, Connecticut. Here's an early house as well. It's still standing, albeit changed. This is the Niall house in 1954. You see the modernist box version. These are some family photos we got from the. That actually might be Roger Niall that left. We got to talk to. He sent us an album. These family photos for us to scan. This one is interesting. I like it because the kid had some fun right there. But also, if you look up the hill in the woods, you can see another structure. Another Woollen house just next door. Also, Buchanan, obviously. Here's a map of the Buchanan modern house tour. You can see the two are immediately located next to each other. His name was misspelled on the program, so that was another difficult part of the whole research process. That people would spell his name 100 different ways. But you can see, the other people on this list: Phil Johnson, John Johansson, Landon Spores, Ellen Quinns, in good company. Back to Indianapolis, Philip showed this photo, which is to establish here's kind of what it looks like today, in addition on the left side there. This is an architectural record. This is a record house in 1957. Prestigious title pulled out annually to the year's most innovative domestic designs. Record note that the house is a big room concept, which was unusual at the time. Here's inside. Again, a lot of these things, a lot of these homes and buildings changed with the years, of course, like Phil mentioned. Almost unrecognizable, but you can kind of start to see the central volume of the Thurston house. Another house in Indy, starting to step away from the strict modernist box and becomes a little more private with some Japanese inspiration. This house expanded on a bigger concept, but within a main great room with two rectangular rooms to form a U-shaped plan, resulting in a central courtyard and a pitched shingled roof. We didn't want to live in a glass house on view to all the world. The owner's wife, the owner, sold house and garden, and you can I like these photos. These are solar. And we knocked on the door one day when we were in town. In Richmond, the current owner, he's actually, I'm forgetting the relationship, he is related somehow to the original owners. The house was passed down through the years, but that's great. Then this is the Madison residence, sort of a neo-Palladian formalist building for a artistic guy, head of the Hair Art School. This one is a pretty distinctive shift that they used. It's called the Roundhouse, also the Haven residence, 1964. After securing the Clues Hall commission, he was approached by Jordan and Joan Lehman to design a new house for the family. Clues was occupying most of his time and interest for the matter. Their presence, their persistence in the list, ideas and issues persuaded them to take the product. Major source of inspiration was the volumes of the Truly huts that dot the landscape around Puglia, Italy. Something he had seen on a poster at tour of Europe. There you see on the right. Another influence he mentions is a project he worked on when he was working for Philip Johnson, the Lucas House on the left. It was never built, and featured a collection of circles on the left to find the envelope. Here's the sun. It's sort of mezzanine of the kitchen and corner. He loves spiral staircases. We're going to talk about houses approach, but this one's also interesting. This is outside of Bloomington for the newly appointed director of the IU Art Museum at the time. It's called the Solly Residence. It's hard to show in a single photo, but it's sort of built into this hill in the woods. There's some construction photos. Former employee Peter Meyer described it to us as a sea ranch home dropped in the hills of Monroe County. And we found it. You know, I actually brought this time. But we eventually did talk to the owner. You see it's quite different looking now. And some paneling installed into the wooden slats. The owner was complaining that the house was just being torn apart by woodpeckers, so it is something. So getting away from houses, but it's still a residential project. This is back in Indianapolis. This is part of the tower. Public housing project on Massachusetts Avenue, built originally for senior citizens. Another building that's tough to photograph in its current state. It's really surrounded by Denseyville Avenue. It was originally planned as a tower park design that annexed and Skybridge connected them. But today the tower stands alone and the park has been redeveloped into a apartment building. Almost fully envelops the lower third building. So kind of reaching around there. This is the original. Pretty dramatic. It's really a landmark in downtown. But you can see what happens as the buildings change. This is one of the entrances to the building. It's really a rather unpleasant welcome home. It's the other side as well, dark. But like so many of these buildings, this vintage of stewardship, lack of maintenance and repair, and constant complaints from current residents. Back down to Bloomington. This is the Musical Arts Center, the IU Jacobs School of Music. It's a pretty spectacular building, I think. It's a piece of his brutalist catalog that I feel like it's overlooked a lot. Let's get back inside, the concert hall. The balcony is stage. These dramatic spiral staircases again, but on a larger scale. Then sort of the mezzanine level of the lobby again. Similar moves he's making some moves, but it's in great shape and it's cared for with a lot more reverence, I think, than most other buildings this scale, certainly, of Woollen's. Now speakers for the ballet, some spotlights on the front. He gets really muscular in the details here. This is the Alexander Calder sculpture. It was designed specifically for the site. It's called Eau Rouge. Now moving down to the country, we're kind of taking a trip here away from Bloomington to New Harmony. It's the New Harmony Inn. Phil introduced it a little bit. It's an interesting town. It's has a history that has many books written about it itself. It's a sleepy little village. About 600 people live there. That was sort of settled as a utopian community that lasted only about 10 years because they were celibate. They couldn't sustain that for very long. That's a short story, but like I said, there's a lot of books about it. But anyway, the town now sort of acts as a spiritual retreat. Jane Blaffer Owen is the sort of steward. She's now passed. Anyway, lose my train of thought. But you can see the move away from strict brutalism, closer to like a Manchurian, referential postmodernism. sort of the chicken room, chicken house, gatehouse, and chapel. But it wasn't always supposed to be a gesture to the humble cabins and hills and towns. This was the first early scheme that resembled a squat, angular addition to his rootless catalog. Upon further consideration, this was scrapped from a growing stance. Woollen would say, I'm very happy with this implement. These are some of the other buildings in town. One right, it's bricks replacement. You kind of see the reference there a little bit. This is an aerial view of the town. Sort of top right dish is the inn, and if you follow a line down to the bottom left, you see Philip Johnson's roofless church. They follow right in line with each other, kind of in direct conversation between the student and teacher, a little bit, going back to their New Canaan days. And then if you follow that line a little bit further down, you see Richard Meyer's Athenaeum, which is pretty, stark change from both of those buildings, really. But it kind of completes this triumvirate of modernism and small religious settlement stuff. Right? Chapel, another round room in the conference center. Was that on later? There's still down there. I'll try to speed up for you guys. St. Mindred Monastery. Pretty special project that we're really lucky to have access to. It's really kind of cloistered away from the public, and it's in the middle of nowhere too. But there's an aerial view. You see the old sanctuary on the left, and then Woollen's triangular addition on the right. This cloistered refectory in the middle. This is sort of the physical and symbolic portal from that any novitiate monk would walk through when they started their journey as a monk. So it's sort of closing the door on the life and entry into the life of the monk through these big wooden doors. There's the monk's garden on the right. And you can see it's a pretty large campus. There's at one point a seminary and a high school, and there's trade shops all over. They built coffins there. That's a little machine shop. It's no longer functioning. Today, it's a hermitage, so someone lives there, but totally shuttered away from society. Here's the side dining hall, dressing tables, the large architecture. You have a connection to the old and new. It's like where the monks would go from their cells to service to serve people. There's a swimming pool overlooking the It's pretty remote, really in the middle of nowhere down in Southern Indiana. And then jumping back to kind of where we started, this is Central Library on the American Legion Hall. If you were to turn 90 degrees to the right, you would look at the Federal Building to start with. You can see there the original buildings. Paul Cray Library is seen in 1937. The building itself was built in 1917 and it still stands today, mostly unchanged, aside from Woollen's addition to the north. It's seen as a temple to a book. And Woollen loved this building, knowing that whenever architects from other cities would visit, he would take them here and show them how magnificent it was. It was also the second Cray design Woollen would add on to in Indianapolis. Just the detail and conversation there. It's the Braden Street looking closely at the glass facade. See this is kind of the connection of this atrium in the middle between the tower on the left and the Cray building on the right. And when you step inside, this is the Cray temple. Still pretty much the same. You can see there's a bit of a plan here. And behind that desk there is the door that would enter into the atrium here down with this view, which is pretty spectacular, especially on a sunny day. It's an early rendering by Helmut Jacobi, who would draw from Woollen throughout the years. So here. You know, it's probably my favorite building in the city. But it was one that was never really covered in the architectural press. Fallout from that, from the construction issues and lawsuits kind of made it so the building couldn't be submitted for award submissions at the time, which is a critical tool in marketing projects. And then on the back side, this is the other side of the building. An interesting northern entrance, but what I want to talk about here is the bronze sculpture on top. That is from 1892, titled Arts, Sciences, and Letters, and it's a nod to the old public library building before Gray's building was in town. This is 1909. If you walk south on Meridian Street, you can see it proudly displayed on top of there. The horse and carriages here really takes the photo. This, when the Gray's building was opened, this building became the public schools administrative offices until it was demolished in 1967. But, you know, of course, the bronze survived. I don't know where it was between 67 and 07. But I'm glad it improved it. Kind of, it's a great nod to the history, something that gets overlooked a lot very often there. And that's enough about buildings, kind of, but here's just a little bit of behind the scenes, kind of, you know, doing the research. Bill pouring over some drawings in the basement of the property, and it's kept everything there. It's pretty convenient, actually. Some plans for the roundhouse. So originally it was supposed to have a third cylinder, which is a garage. You can see that yellow drawing. And that's actually almost completed now. The new owner decided to create the third building. I think it's almost done. Here's our first day at the Indiana Historical Society archives. All those boxes were for us. It was kind of overwhelming, so we made a lot of trips back. We did through all of that. There's Father Harry Hagen. He gave us a personal tour of the monastery, which we were not prepared for, really. Like I said, it's cloistered to the public, so no one can really go in. He was happy to show us around. We're really, really grateful for that. It's an amazing place to experience. Photos. Here's the Columbia University George Service Archive. Here's the Library of Congress, DC. That's our Colorado shots. Back at the back, Phil, there's Adam Teese and John Wright racing, were helpful in our research. There's me taking a picture, and Phil's taking a picture of me doing that. Pictures and trucks. I do want to add one little interesting tidbit to our research process. Phil found this, I'm not even sure when, but along the way, there's this brochure from the Japan World Expo in 1970, the U.S. Pavilion, soccer. It kind of just lays out the various installations and galleries from this expo. On the first page is a 1915 Stutz Bearcat booklet, actually, which was designed and built in Indianapolis. Yeah, kind of fun facts. Yeah. More importantly, it was the architecture gallery. It was made up of backlit transparencies hanging all over the room, showcasing various American technologies of the era and past eras. It's all adapted from an Ivan Sherman's book with photos by Magnum photographer Elliot Herbert. If you look at the left edge of the photo, right in the center is a familiar image. 4-story tower just kind of showed up. We had no idea, but we tracked down the photo. So this isn't a book, actually, I mentioned, but yeah, another just kind of unexpected, big moment of publicity, you know, the World's Expo, but not too big window, not much about all of these things. So this is kind of good. And in closing, one more building. We did notice this one kind of distinctive model photo we found in the past. It's the Rots engineering building for Woollen, a lot of projects through the years. And you know, it's kind of a, I'm not even sure it's terribly spectacular building. Here's a slide. It's kind of a low slopes, dramatic sawtooth facade. It's, you know, pretty basic, humble structures, simple materials. Here's the inside, just a really open office plan with some separate offices, separate private offices along the street side. But, you know, good, well lit. It's rid of fluorescent tubes blasting down on draftsmen. So we found this. I found the address and I decided to visit on this. It's just out past the Motor Speedway on High School Road. This shot's from June 2024. I just decided to walk around and tell myself, but it's in pretty good shape. I thought the landscaping was kind of intact. But I made a second trip in January of 2025. And found this just the state of everything. This rendering board had fallen down in a storm, I think, just hang down. But you know, everything had been ripped up. They painted it black and added this big aluminum shed, right? There's another building on the left side there. But anyway, this just kind of shows, this illustrates our point of how quickly things change when no one's really paying attention. I had a chance to talk to the owners of this building. They had no idea about anything, really. But again, like I said, I'm not sure it's an important building. We don't want to make a claim that all of these buildings need to be maintained as these sort of house museums. But I just think a little bit more understanding would definitely help. And I'll leave it on this. This is Evans' house in Colorado, shot at night. He's actually sitting on the couch there in his living room. This was, I think, his last project. He finally had something for himself. Little art studio. He got into painting a lot. All these paintings were his hidden art studio on the right side. I think it's still standing, but there was a fire, I think, about a year ago. And I got word that it may have been destroyed in fire. So, anyway. Hopefully that wasn't too boring.
Exact opposite. One more round of I bet everyone is buzzing with questions after that. But to kick it off, I want to go back to, I think it was a quote that kind of shows where the title of the book came from, which was that, jump in if I'm off on this, said, Evans once said that for him, his primary concern was not what a building looks like, but it was what the building does. Is that his quote, or was that someone else talking about his quote?
Yeah, that was his quote, and I mean, also to say titles are funny things, so don't read too much into it, or to sell books. But yeah, that was like a kind of motto, slogan that we heard from a bunch of people. I quoted a bunch, more in the latter half of his career. And it was less about like, the building's appearance, but more about what is its impact on its neighborhood and its people. Particularly this building, talking about like it's not meant to be a pretty building. It's also very quotable. So that was one of the things he said. So choosing that title plus the subtitle, we're trying to just play with like what's the point of these buildings, or like what is their purpose then now, and some getting beyond just how it looks, but how it functions, and of course, stuff that us critique and evaluate whether we agree with that, but at least having some knowledge about the intent is important.
Yeah, I ask it as a lead-in because, and maybe this is just from seeing all of his work as a compendium to get a sense of the diversity of styles that he deployed. But I was especially fascinated by the shift you showed in the University Music building, where you had the model of the very brutalist style project for the new harmony in, kind of following on the tails of the music center, and that very conscious shift to the Mediterranean, more kind of rural, referential form. So to me, that's where I found the quote in hindsight kind of funny, because at least in his arsenal of what a building can do, it seems like he was very hyper-aware of what a building looks like. It's kind of his opening swing, I guess, in defining what a building can do, especially this building. So I'm curious to kind of flip the title one last time, and then I'll stop blabbing. But I'm curious, now that you've documented all these things, are there moments outside of Woollen's work that you see as kind of stating as a result of what these buildings have done? Like in the way that this, the federal building exists as a provocation to the great city, or the shot of the Bard Towers from the Osaka Expo. All of those stand as really bold provocations, and I think the new Harmony and showed that he was aware of what and how he was provoking visually. I'm curious if you can see reverberations in the city today that can kind of be traced back to his entire era.
That's a great question.
I mean, just sort of on this, read the book. Go much deeper into this. I'm curious, but like he chose this design. The original design for this was actually a tower, like very modernist tower before topology. So he chose, but then he changed it to be this like very ornamental front form to define. He thought was like a Italian piazza plaza. So he was very much focused on like long-term life of the building. He knew like these other buildings might not be filled in his lifetime. He said even like this would be a 100-year-old process. But like he had foresight to think about like the kind of greater good that this building might bring. We were just talking about this before though. Like this is a pretty hated building locally. It's also like a federal building, so it's part of the hatred is what goes on inside. Like the IRS has been there, FBI has been there. This was on the list of one of Trump's buildings to sell. It's also currently being used as like a makeshift ICE immigration courthouse. So that doesn't help with the public perception of these places. So I mean, we're gonna do like a talk in Indianapolis, and I'm curious to. I think the reactions to these buildings are gonna be very different than they were here. Everyone has an opinion on this stuff, and may not even be aware of the good that the form of this building might be doing in there, how it feels to walk down the sidewalk, and how it feels to inhabit this space over here, even though what's going on over there is connected. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's a key question to
I can keep blabbing with questions, but I will, if anyone has a hand or a question too, I'll keep eyes out.
I've got a question for Niall. When you approach photographing a building, what was your process? Like, how do you do that? So your photos are so very intimate and really overwhelming, and you capture something really nice in your photography about a sense of context. I'm just curious as to how you approach it.
I don't want to sound obtuse, but it is kind of, I can't really explain it. It's really a feeling, and it's just kind of years of practice of seeing with your eyes, translating a three-dimensional space to a two-dimensional photograph. It takes some time to learn. I'm not saying I'm the best in Portland at all. There's plenty of other people than me, but yeah, it's a tough one to pinpoint really. But in this long-term project like this, I'll say it's like we have the luxury of time, 5 years, to make these trips and spend this time doing it. So I never felt rushed really. So there's the photos you see here and even the book is a fraction of what was actually captured. So a lot of editing helps with that. Well, you compare things, you say this one's crap, this one's good. Next.
And this was like a drone shot taken year 2 or something. Like so.
Yeah, the skyline is different now. I think even.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Today.
As you both learned more about Evans as native Hoosiers, how did it change your perception of your home state, if at all?
I don't know if it changed too much. I think Phil and I are probably the biggest boosters of Indianapolis. This side of Indiana. Always trying to get the word out about how good it is. You guys should go visit, check it out. So it's like a what's that? It's the kind of thing where I can make fun of Indianapolis, but no one else in this room is allowed to. I can give you credit for it all, but to me, it's an interesting story for sure.
I think we also subconsciously attach ourselves to the story. Us leaving Indianapolis, living away, you kind of have to come back to appreciate, and we'll admit that. That's simplifying the story, but so there's a little bit of us enlightened New Yorkers coming back to Indianapolis and telling everyone what they're missing, and we're very conscious of that. But I think again we're really excited to see what impact this makes locally, because we just feel like there's such a interesting architectural conversation, not just this, but so many other things that no one's talking about. They're talking about it in Chicago and Columbus, but not in Indianapolis. So, we'll see.
Yeah, thanks so much. This is fascinating. I have 2 questions, but I'll make it one. It's very intriguing to think about him having this international, well-recognized and positive press of sorts, but in his local area and town actually being pretty much not appreciated. And I'm wondering if in your research something came out about his own writing or understanding of what happened, or was he keeping trying to please Indiana people, or not necessarily? So that's very fascinating to me. But also then I'm thinking, you've done so much research about him, and I'm wondering if you had him here, what would you ask? So I know this is 2 questions.
So it's tough, both of those questions. He passed away in 2016, so all we have is the writings that he left. And he wasn't a prolific writer, so a lot of it's through newspaper posts. We also interviewed 30 to 40 people who work with him, some who are here today, so we can talk to them. And I think his relationship with Indianapolis changed over his career. I think at a certain point, it was at that new harmony point, 1975 beyond, kind of gave up trying to win over those locals for whatever reason. There's a lot of reasons we can speculate. And the quote we have at the end about it was one of the last talks he gave in the city. He's so refreshing. He seems like he's really matured into this understanding of why he was practicing architecture. A younger architect was probably practicing for those accolades, for that press, and he grew into a more mature belief of it was something greater than himself. I would love to ask him kind of really what he thought of Indianapolis, how he wrestled with that. There's a whole other story that he actually left the city for a moment in time, opened an office somewhere else, then came back. Yeah, don't have time to get into that today, but yeah, that's kind of a meta narrative that we had to piece together as much as we could because it's complex, but unfortunately we wasn't here to tell us about it.
Do you need a legacy of modernism in Indianapolis, and do other architects, only recently I know so many people that inspire? Is there any legacy there?
In In terms of the build work in town, I don't think so. You know, there's a few houses I can think of, but generally a lot of people that worked for him would go on to different cities and firms, and then maybe start their own firm somewhere else. It's probably
Yeah.
the simplest way.
I mean, we talked to even architects who are practicing in the city today and who, like, didn't even know who he was. So there's definitely some sort of lack of knowledge about him. But everyone knows, like, again, if you haven't been to Indianapolis, like, everyone knows his building. So it's this weird irony. But yeah, it's not like New Canaan or anywhere else where there's just like modern house after modern house. It's very, very rare. And if there are any, it's more brickwood right kind of style.
I have a question for both of you. From like when this book started as just an idea to where you are now, what did you learn that was most unexpected?
How crazy archives are, I think. And how important they are, really. But it's really something I've never thought of before.
Yeah, totally.
It's crazy. Just I can't even really tell you how much stuff there was. It was probably a fraction of what was actually. There's probably so much stuff that didn't make it into the archive.
And we kept finding new buildings that we were like, oh, he did that. Like,
Right.
so for St. Richard's folks here, he designed St. Richard's. We did not know that. Our elementary school. Yeah. So very like minor building, but like, and he did, you know, tons of historic preservation that people don't know about. So yeah, he's kind of his fingerprints are everywhere knows, and that's all through the archive. Like no one, we were the first people to get into his archive. No one had done it before, so yeah.
As you walked through the buildings, it was really clear there's this huge evolution in where these stats and things ended up. One thing that struck me was the real mix of materials, like even with that building at the end, has the gills on the side when you zoomed in. I was really surprised to see that it was that low brick. Can you speak a little bit to his approach to material and texture?
Question. Yeah, he like thought about it very deeply, and he didn't ask on this, but all the interiors he also thought about. So like it was all the whole thing was very much like on his mind. Like here, this building was actually meant to be marble. I mean not marble, limestone, like flues, and then it was Valley Engineer and cut. Just ended up being concrete, but he specifically chose this shade of concrete to match this limestone color here. And there's another Scottish Rite Cathedral, another building, limestone building over here. And like, you know, samples of that exact aggregate and all of that. So that was very much on his mind. That church, that maybe you're thinking too, that kind of brick, blocky building. He talked about industrial materials as a way to like remove any barriers you had in the spiritual relationship or kind of event in the church. He talked about the outside as like a slip cover for what happens inside. So yeah, and it was very much in that modernist mode of kind of express structure and industrial materials. As Niall said, like that also looked very cheap buildings. So yeah, that was very much part of on his mind. And even later in the more postmodern, like that the museum we showed, colorful yellow museum, the gable, like very much choosing those colors, materials, all of that. Was very, very intentional.
I was wondering if you guys could say a little bit about his process. I think, I don't know, hearing a little bit about his process, but it seemed like can't come on site, things like that, something like that. I don't know if that's like a typical process for how he came to formulate concepts for something like that.
Well, again, he was always refining the process. I think for years, it's kind of every building was different, obviously. think, you know, I didn't mention it about the monastery. He moved in with the monks at one point in the early phases of the process. So what are kind of their, I think it was like 2 weeks, 2 week stay with the monks to learn their rituals of their day and like just how they use space and the building and move through life basically. Use that as a starting point. That was pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, like, and that was, we think, a big part of how it will change. So, like, the monastery didn't have to do that. It was a big honor that the monks even let them do that. And we talked to monks who were there when it happened. So, and he would constantly then relate design decisions back to what he experienced living in that kind of environment. So yeah, like just like not imposing his own ideas, but being responsive was super important, at least in the later phases. Yes.
Phil, you spoke a bit about his involvement in broader planning, conversations, and projects, and him sort of being a champion for density and urbanism. One of the graphics you showed also had a sea of parking on it. So I'm curious if that was a conversation that he stayed in through the course of his career, if it was one that he was had like a successful voice in, not so much. I'm sure it's in the book, but if you can expand.
Just like us for probably less successful than he wanted to for a couple reasons. One, he was a unique personality, which we'll get into the book. Very forthright and opinionated. He was also like a Democrat in a town that was controlled by Republicans from 1968 forward until 1969. So like honestly, all those, not all. We showed 3 master plans. 2 of them did not happen for a variety of reasons. And that specific graph you're talking about was like him modeling the problems of the urban forces. So that was like the things he was trying to solve. So yeah, I think less. What we kind of document in the book is that his plans though kind of led to other people taking up his plans and changing them and translating them. So it is this, you know, cruel of different ideas that build on one another. But yeah, like he had some people who agree with him, some didn't, and for different reasons. Yeah, it's a complex topic.
Questions. I'm just curious. You mentioned like St. Margaret and also St. Thomas. Was he a two-parter, personally religious himself, and then also, again, you touched on it in both your presentations, but how did he feel that a building could either facilitate worship and successfully, and maybe what did he see as like lacking, or was he critical of other worship spaces that didn't sort of match his idea?
He was religious. He was Episcopalian. He went to Christ Church on the Circle, very old, you know, patrician church in Indianapolis. So he was always very interested in religion, and then much later in his life, actually kind of totally changed his point of view and got into Eastern religion and went on retreats and all sorts of stuff, which I don't have time to get into. But yeah, I would say he was super interested in any space that had some sort of spiritual meaning to it. So the monastery, which is like more crazy about this, that was like huge for him. And there's so many different metaphors and meanings of that building. Yeah, it's a book that have a religious, spiritual meaning to it. I don't think he was like, he did a lot of churches because there was easy money in the 60s and 70s, and a lot of cheap churches. So a lot of like young congregations that needed a quick church you could do. I think he was like very much, I don't think his church work was like super radical for his time. There were a lot of architects doing that, and especially with the changing relationship to religion in that time. But it is like a huge part of his practice, and like I would say one of the areas of his work that's most well preserved are his churches. So yeah, I think it's definitely a huge part of his work.
Final questions.
Do you guys have a favorite mean, I like the library. That's, yeah. It's just a really, it doesn't, there's really no other building like it in Indy, I would say. The use of glass, just the spatial feeling of that atrium, and then even the tower where the stacks of books are. You can go up to the top floor and look out at the mall, and you see the skyline, and you also see it's a big part of the tower. You can kind of look around and kind of point to those other touches.
Same. I mean, it's basically where we're sitting right now is where the library is.
Yeah.
And my sister got married there, so that's a cool personal connection. So, yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Again, books will be for sale. Phil and Niall will be here, so any lingering questions, please corner them one-on-one. And then eventually, 9 p.m.-ish is a migration to the river if you're available and interested. And thank you again all for coming.